Hello, Period 3 World History. Welcome to Module 13, the French Revolution and Napoleon. This is the unit that we began before we left for this coronavirus pandemic. And we're going to return to it in a little bit of a different way. I wanted to do my own notes on this or lecture of my own because I just find this like really fascinating. And I hope you guys do too. Now, I've kind of mentioned it before, but the French Revolution encompasses a total slew of events in a short period of time, so it does get confusing. I'll show you within my notes and I'll guide you through it. Along the way here, I'm going to make a lot of comparisons to the United States today, and I just want you to know that I'm not at all insinuating that we are on the verge of any type of revolution in the United States. Rather, I'm just using it to kind of just put things into perspective for you as a class. And we're going to make some comparisons in this first part of the French Revolution, just comparing kind of where, just I guess checking in on the temperature. Um, so why a car window? That's exactly why. It's because we're going to go through this and it's going to seem like so many things are happening so fast as we're moving through it that it's going to be hard to even really get a chance to really soak it all in. Now, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution are going to be two major things that are going to bring this modern world that we're talking about in. And the French Revolution is just a contradictory period of events, as you guys are going to see. I'm sure you know some basic things about it, but it's going to usher in um, modern democratic politics. But it's also going to bring terror and murder and eventually lead to a ruler who's probably the one of the most despotic, imperialistic rulers in history. Um, so here we go. I'm going to bring you through this story. Now, I wanted to put this in because he did such a good job on it. Um, at this point, well, this is Brandon's version of the Great Chain of Being here. I kind of wanted him to explain it to class, but this is something that we've talked about in the past. This is the old feudal order. Now, when you think of France, you have to think that it's very unlike the United States in the way that it's made up in this era that we're talking about. Now we're in the late 1700s, so we're Maria Theresa is still queen right now. Um, Catherine the Great is on her way out, and England is emerging as a world power in trade, but it's still looked at as France is the world power. But France is much, much deeper caught into this system of this feudal system, as we're going to see. Now, the French Revolution broke out in France in 1789, and it would last 10 years. Um, it drew inspiration from the enlightened ideas that we've talked about in the past, and it had an effect internationally throughout the world. And would eventually, and this is why we're studying it, unleash 23 years of nonstop warfare throughout Europe. Now, the easiest way to remember it, and I think sometimes different teachers phrase these or categorize these differently, is in the beginning there's a moderate phase, but you should know that, and we'll get into it, that it was more about establishing a constitutional monarchy like we've talked about in England. The second phase is a radical phase, and that's the phase that you guys may have heard about in other classes where you hear some of the abuses and horror stories of the French Revolution. And then obviously we move into a conservative phase. I keep talking about this push-pull, where people had enough of the violence and went back to many of the same things that were happening early on before the French Revolution. And then instead of a king, we have Napoleon come to power, and he established an emperor's empire. So we have an emperor instead of a king, which is pretty amazing that we go through these phases of people taking control, radicals taking control, nobles taking control, and then ultimately a non-Frenchman in Napoleon becoming the empire or the Emperor of France. Now on the right, you see that I have a little picture because I really want to ask the question, and the term that you guys should know is egalitarianism. All right, this is the idea that people are equal and deserve equal rights. Um, and I talk about this a lot. I used to talk about it when I taught U.S. history. Is of course everybody wants idealistically people to be treated equally, but there's always a trade-off. So it's a matter of what is fair and what is equal. All right. If I don't work as hard as someone else, should I get equal pay as the other person who works harder than me? And there's a balance between these two principles. So I don't think personally that it's one way or another. But when you think egalitarianism, if you're following the election, think Bernie Sanders, because that's his basic principles is universal. Like everybody deserves. What are the things that everybody deserves? And I'm sure within this class, people fit all along the spectrum depending on the issue. So I think this picture does it justice. All right, well, I'm going to give you a little bit of background here as far as where we left off. Now, if you remember, we left off with Louis XIV for the most part. Now, when Louis XIV was king, if you remember, he went through two wars to try to take control of the falling Spanish Empire. The first was the 9 Years' War, and the second was the War of Spanish Succession. Now, we've talked about them a lot, and after those wars were over, he lost both wars, and it really, really shook Europe as far as beating the mighty, mighty France. And I said after these wars were over, Great Britain emerged as the world power, but worldwide that was not necessarily recognized. Immediately after he died, um, he basically left France as he found it. The nobility was groaning still from high taxes, from all these wars, and he left a young boy on the crown. If you remember, and I think I went over this briefly, uh, most of Louis's sons had died. One died with his wife of smallpox or measles, which I don't think we know which one. Um, the other two young children got it as well, and one of the young brothers was saved. Um, all of the grandchildren, but Philip V of Spain, were dead. Now, if you remember, Philip V was the one that he wanted to make the heir to his throne and would unite the kingdoms of Spain and France. But under the treaty, Philip V was not allowed to be king of both Spain and France. And both Spain and France were left so devastated after the wars that it was nearly impossible anyway, because it would have started a war if he claimed the kingdom of both. So a 5-year-old child ended up succeeding Louis the 14th. I think it was his great grandson. And this left an opening for the aristocracy, which had been um, I guess, put in their place by Louis XIV. Now, if you remember, one of his genius things is he hired middle class members, not nobility, but middle class members of society, like his finance minister Colbert, if you remember, who owed allegiance to him because he was offering them positions which had not previously been offered to them in the past, and gave him control over much of France. Well, after he died and a 5-year boy takes over, um, they established a regency council, which basically allowed the nobles to take control of France again, and they cut down or on many of the reforms that Louis had enacted. But overall, if you remember moving on, um, France had a good period of time as most of Europe was being who had colonial empires were successful. And after the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, if you remember, they're one and the same war, um, France had emerged in a great deal of debt. Now, in the 1700s, France was considered one of the most advanced countries in all of Europe. It had a large population. It was still prosperous in foreign trade. It was the center of the Enlightenment, and their culture was largely praised and imitated by the rest of the world. I mean, if you remember the video that we watched, someone asked, why are they speaking French? I think it was the Catherine the Great video. And I said that most of the nobility throughout Europe spoke French because they were looked up upon, just like how many people would speak English throughout Europe today. Whether it was resented, it was the culture of Europe. However, beneath that appearance, things were deceiving. I mean, there was great unrest in France, and that's what we're going to talk about. There's bad harvests, high taxes, and these enlightened ideals of Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire are spreading throughout the French population in one way or another. Now we're really going to take some time to define the old order, which is the Estates General, which I mean, it says the old order here, but I'm probably going to call it the old regime as we talk and move forward. Now, one thing you overall have to remember just about a complete different way of thinking in France is that most people were subjects, not citizens. Now, think about the difference. You're a subject or not a citizen. Even regarding your mentality as a person. A citizen, I believe I have rights. A subject, I'm going to do what I'm told to do. You guys are my subjects, not citizens. Now, we've talked about some of the enlightened changes which were happening in France, but what you have to remember is France had a history, much more of a history than the United States for certain, and the older ties were stronger in France. Now, France was affected by the Protestant Reformation, but for the most part, you have to remember that France was Catholic, and Catholic traditions and way of thinking still held. And while there was a push forward from the Enlightenment, that push forward happened mostly in the cities and in the middle class. Now, in the 1770s, so we're talking in the period of time of the American Revolution, this social and political system, called the old regime, was still in place. Now, the Estates General. The Estates General was a caste system based on privilege. All right, so certain people had rights that other people did not have. So not everybody had the same rights. It was hierarchical, which we've talked about, comes from medieval times. And this structured every relationship. The king over his subjects, the lords over their peasants, men over women, fathers over sons, masters over slaves in the colonies, and clergies over lay people. And everyone believed, or in the past, and this is still there underneath, is that this was sanctioned by God. Now you remember, it's still Catholic, so these ideas are conflicting. Now, this idea of privilege, not everybody was the same before the law. Now, this is a modern way of thinking, and this is the change that we're talking about. And the second thing about the privilege was taxes. The first and second estates were largely free from taxes. Now, we're going to talk about them in a second. The first estate, I've talked about them as those who pray. This was the Roman Catholic clergy, who were only tied in church courts by other religious people formed these courts, so they had basically their own legal system within France. They did not pay taxes and owned 10% of the land. They made money. They were still making a lot of money, but they did do good things. I mean, they provided education and they provided relief for the poor. So they contributed about 2% of their income to the government, but paid no taxes on their land, while these lands were making tons of money. So bishops and clergy were becoming very wealthy. And then you have the second estate. That's those who fight historically. All right. Now you have dukes, barons, counts. I mean, I can't even keep track of them. And I really don't even know the hierarchical structure within the different titles. But if you lived in that era, you certainly would. You would know the rights. And if you met a count, you would know exactly what that meant. And if you were a count, you might want to be a duke. And if you were a duke, you might want to be a baron or a lord. Makes me think of like brown belt, black belt, red belt in karate. Like I can't tell the difference. I mean, I know black belt's the highest, and I know brown doesn't sound like a good color. But just think, in that period of time, people dreamed of being a baron, or just knew exactly, that hierarchy because they grew up with it. Now, this nobility made up less than 2% of the population, but they controlled a lot of the wealth, and they paid a few of the taxes. So they controlled about 20% of the land. They operated in the key positions of government and in the military. Now, lastly, you have the third estate. This is a huge estate, and there's a lot of different groups in it. So 90% of the population made up the third estate. And at the top of this group was the bourgeoisie, which I'm not even sure they were called that then, they might have been. But these were the city dwelling merchants. So this was the new money when we're talking historically. So these were professionals. They had no role in government, but they were highly educated and they were rich. They were making money off of all this trade and commerce that was starting to happen. Now, if you remember, the nobles could not engage in trade and commerce because it was considered dirty. All right, so they couldn't. So this was a place that only this group of people had access to. This included bankers, factory owners, merchants, professionals, skilled artisans, but they were educated. And these people believed in the enlightened ideal. So this is kind of historically, and these are the things that Marx is later going to study and see. Like these are the people who are going to push. They may have been rich, but they paid high taxes and they lacked these privileges. Now, they could buy into nobility, which was starting to become common. So, as the nobles wanted money and as the middle class wanted privilege, a lot of times they'd marry noble women or daughters to become nobility so that they could gain privilege. So you would actually try to make money to buy yourself into the nobility. And I talked a little bit about this in Spain, how it kind of messed up their economy. Um, but this was a group that was growing in Western Europe as commerce started to grow. Now, next underneath them were the artisans and workers in the cities. So this is like the shoemakers, carpenters, bricklayers, dressmakers, like people who worked with their hands, laborers. These were known as the sans-culottes, and we're going to talk about them later, which is those without knee breeches. So you can see in the photo, all right, the sans-culottes are carrying, all right, the nobility. So these were the poorest of the third estate, which is strange in a way because you would think that the peasants would be, which we're going to get to. But these were considered tradespeople, apprentices, laborers, and domestic servants. They were paid low wages and they were frequently out of work. Right? They were often hungry, and as the cost of bread rose, it greatly affected them. So this getting bread to the cities is going to be a main thing. You got to think if you live in the country, you still have access to what you need to survive, even in bad times, unless it's really, really bad. And that brings us to the peasants. So these peasants farmed the nobles' lands. They were the largest group, more than 8% of France's 26 million people. They farmed small plots, but they couldn't sustain in bad weather seasons, so they still did not live a great life. And as time went on, the nobles started moving further and further away from these lands. So it was relationship based early on. They took care of their peasants. So when times were bad, the nobles stored extra grain and gave it to them. They also had special dues called seigneury dues, which was now basically part of their investment. So they were making money off these lands, these tithes or royal taxes that they were collecting from the peasants. A lot of times it wasn't actually money, but it was in the form of harvests. So these peasants had to pay taxes to the nobles and the church, and they were getting taxed like crazy. And also, which is absolutely insane to me, they would have to actually, without pay, during certain parts of the year, go and do public projects like working on roads, all right, and building things. So they had a lot of demands in this period of time. Or as the Enlightenment hit them, they also saw some chinks in this armor and resented the nobility, especially as the nobility was moving more to the cities and like that personal relationship was starting to devolve. Now, I talked about it a little bit in the last slide, so I'm not going to go into it too much now, but this old regime social order, it was broken. Now, you do the math. Population of France in 1787, this is 2 years before the revolution, 90%, 97% um, was the third estate in the population. 1% is the first estate, which was the clergy, and 2% were the second estate, which were the nobility. But the income paid in taxes was 2% on the first estate, 0% from the nobility, and 50% on the third estate. So I don't. The other percent of taxes were probably like salt taxes and things on certain goods, which was shared between them and maybe isn't in the numbers right there. But the basic concept you need to understand is things were broken. I mean, you can only really push so far. Now, if you look at the images on the left, I have another example of the sans culotte, and they're going to come up again, those without knee breeches. All right. They couldn't afford to wear the knee breeches because they were working in it was considered someone people who didn't work dressed like that. So that becomes a little bit of a theme behind what is going on here. Now, after the 7 Years' War, what you're going to start to see is um, France was in bad shape economically, and I'll go into a little bit more now. But this rift between the rich and the poor is visibly becoming more noticeable. Now, kind of pay attention to the story here because things get a little bit out of order mentally. So, the enlightened ideas I talked about, Voltaire, Rousseau. I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide. I'm going to talk in this slide. I'm going to focus mostly on the aspect of the financial crisis. Now, I'm sure you remember from the American Revolution, um, and this is Louis XVI, who's the king that we're going to talk about. Um, kind of waited to see that America had a chance in the Revolutionary War, and then gave tons of aid, which actually shifted the war into our favor. Now, after the war, France was in tons and tons of debt from this, and in order to kind of hide this debt that they were in, they engaged in something called conspicuous consumption. All right, this is where the government started actually spending money to try to like show that they weren't actually going poor. So they began projects like building certain things in Paris, building up the navy, private industry, but this destroyed French credit. So if if you keep borrowing money and you don't have money coming in, that is going to ruin your credit. And if you have bad credit, generally the bank is going to charge you a higher rate of interest. So, if I go for a loan on my house and I have a bad credit rating, I'm actually going to pay a higher percent. So the poorer you are, the more you get nailed in that. But in this case, we're talking about a country. So they're borrowing money from other countries to pay for these projects when they don't have the money, and they're paying back rates at as high as 50%, which is incredibly high. So at this point, one half of the revenue was going just to pay off the debt, and you're going to have a little activity off of that. So these are the general causes, and I'm focusing more here on the financial crisis. So in the middle of this financial crisis, the French finance minister, Jacques Necker, who's going to come in later, was hugely popular among the people because instead of raising taxes to pay for this, he just took out more and more loans. So the people loved him because they weren't getting taxed as much. But meanwhile, behind the scene, you can only take out loans to pay things when you don't have the money to back up those loans for only a period of time before things are going to come to a head. So he published this false budget and declares, hey, France is doing fine, which is, think about it, the government lying to the people about how much is owed. But the problem is going to be in 1788 and 89, there's an agrarian crisis. So there were huge food shortages, and there was a depression in textile in the cities, which led to famine. So people weren't working in the cities, and there was no food, so food prices are going to go up, and this is going to kill the poor who are already being taxed like crazy. So landlords tried to raise taxes to pay for things because everything got put onto the poor, and basically the peasants couldn't even pay the taxes. So basically this social hierarchy was broken. Now, Louis calls the nobles, and he basically is begging for money. And he opens up the books, and some of them new, but like they look at the books and are like, oh my God, we are in bad shape. But they still refuse to raise taxes. Now they got to think like a lot of these nobles want more freedom and rights. They don't want a king to be telling them what to do. So they're not going to pay taxes unless they get something in return. And this is basically going to be the thing that just breaks it. So if you look at the picture, Louis asks France to air their grievances. So like he gives everybody a chance to complain. And this is just going to open up a Pandora's box. Now, I've continued to refer to this. I don't feel like I need to go over it too much, but these ideas that are circulating. Now, in this period of time, you have Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu. You should know these names. And the Enlightenment is combining like this scathing criticism of this hierarchy, but also with like tremendous optimism that we can change things. So it's not like just this negative attitude; it's this idea of progress that I keep talking about that goes with the Enlightenment. That if we figure things out, that we can make a better world. But how do you make a better world becomes the question. So a lot of people thought that they could remake society based on these scientific principles. Now, in the course of this time, literacy is rising. So one third of women and half of men in France at this point can read. So ideas are circulating. So even people who can't read, when that many people can read, are somewhat aware of these ideas that are being spread because people are reading and talking. And the main idea is kind of like Rousseau. It's like we have this lab, and how do we create a society where people are equal, moral, and free at the same time? All right, so some people are going to need to surrender liberty to the group. All right, so if you remember, there was a guy who had this idea that we had to submit to a king or a leviathan. I don't know if you guys remember his name. Give you a second. All right, that was Hobbes. Now, the enlightened idea is more that we are going to surrender the general will is to each other, like between each other as people. We are going to decide what is good. And this is basically what our legal system does. So, I might not like that I have to wear a seatbelt, but this is what society has decided. So I have to do it and fit into this so that I get other rights because we're trying to kind of figure out this equal idea for all of us. Now, you could say that the American Revolution kind of is these ideas in lab, but France's lab is very, very different. The American Revolution happened in a land that had no history of privilege. All right, it was people who came from Great Britain who fought against the idea of privilege, and that's why they came to America. But you really have to look at France as a place where like these ideas were just more deeply embedded into society. And I think about some of the things in American society that are embedded now, and they're hard to change because people say like this was in the Constitution, this has been here for all these times. So sometimes you become kind of a product of your history. So America was unique and like it wasn't weighed down by centuries of privileges and kings, and some of these are glorious eras throughout French history. Now, when a country or anything is faced with really, really dire times, it's incredibly important is the question is who is the leader at that time, and leaders are either made throughout history or destroyed based on those decisions. So I mean, just think about right now in American history, like, do we have the right leader? And I'm gonna do an activity to have you guys answer that question, but I'm going to talk about Louis the 16th. Now, Louis the 14th, all right, was the famous French king that we've talked about. Louis the 15th is in this period between, the French Revolution and around 1714, around there, somewhere around there is when Louis the 14th passed away. And like I said, France grew, but the nobility kind of grows in that in between era, and there was a period of economic success leading up to the American Revolution, which ultimately leads France on the verge of bankruptcy. So was Louis the 16th the right man at the right time? Now, at his coronation, what Louis the 16th did is he goes out to the crowd and he performs this thing called the royal touch. Now, this is something historically that people believe that kings were from God and that they were the closest soldier, I don't know if I'm using the right word, of God here on earth. So if he touched someone, people believe that you could heal them. And this is something that during the era of the Enlightenment that most people would not have believed and most kings probably would not have performed. Now we're going to see you move into Russia, and before the Russian Revolution, there's still czars who think that they have this ability as chosen ones from God. But the perception through history is that Louis the 16th was stupid, but he was well read. He spoke like three or four different languages. His biggest problem was that he was shy, that he was awkward. He wasn't dumb. He was just indecisive. So a lot of people really liked him, actually. It just, the press didn't. So it just shows you and this is something I want you to examine, is perception sometimes is key. All right, and I kind of talked about that in the chain of kings in England. Sorry. Additionally, he was married to the famous Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette, if you remember, was one of the daughters of 12 kids of Maria Theresa of Austria. You probably don't remember this, but the relationship between Austria and France was one that was precarious. If you remember, early on in the War of Austrian Succession, they fought against Austria. So they had been enemies forever. And I said they were the ones that switched sides in the 7 Years' War, which became part of the French and Indian War, where they actually fought on the same side. So as they're developing this new relationship, of course, Maria Theresa marries off her daughter, Marie Antoinette, to the French king. But this was hard for the French people to swallow. Now, Marie Antoinette was 15 years old at the time. All right. Sorry, she was 14 years old. And she was the 15th child of Maria Theresa. It was made as a diplomatic alliance, but she really, really, really struggled with this relationship. They did not love each other. And additionally, early on, she struggled to produce an heir. She did eventually produce 4 children, including 2 boys, but her reputation never really recovered. Like, there was these rumors that circulated that she took on men and women as lovers. She was a spendthrift. She bought all these luxurious things because that's the way that she grew up, and she thought that that's how royalty should act. And in a time where France was suffering, the people looked at her as just a symbol of greed. Now, in the slide, I have a picture of the diamond necklace affair. Not a major thing to really know, but this is just a case where a lesser noblewoman managed to swindle this guy to buy this diamond necklace for Marie Antoinette. Now, it's not proven that she had any part of this, but the guy smuggles the necklace out and basically stole the money. And Louis, instead of dealing with it behind the scenes, tries the man in the highest court. Now, Marie Antoinette was not put on trial for it and was innocent, but in the court of public opinion, she is going to be accused of shady dealing over this illicit, supposedly love affair. So just Louis emerges from this and just a symbol of how people perceived him as looking weak and politically inept. So you have basically things coming to a head in France, and you have this weak leader married to this woman that people do not want as their queen.